Molt bé, doncs si us sembla començaríem l'acte donant-vos en primer lloc la benvinguda i l'agraïment per haver vingut en aquesta conferència que, com sabeu per la publicitat, si no ho sabeu potser us heu equivocat de sala, sereu a temps de canviar, organitza un cicle de conferències la Càtedra de Multilingüisme, Linguamón-UOC, que és una iniciativa conjunta de la Casa de les Llengües, Linguamón, i la Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. Aquí hi ha el director, l'Isidor Marí, a la fila 5, i jo com a secretari executiu de la càtedra, doncs us dono la benvinguda en nom de la càtedra. Estic molt content de poder presentar el doctor Fernand de Varennes, perquè és, m'atreviria a dir, un bon amic, una persona amb qui molts catalans hem sintonitzat des del primer dia, perquè, tot i que les trajectòries són diferents, ell ve del món del dret i us farà una exposició molt des de la posició, una posició jurídica i del món del dret, i jo, per exemple, vinc de la planificació lingüística i, en canvi, constantment trobo que parlem dels mateixos, les mateixes qüestions, anava a dir els mateixos problemes, de vegades sí són problemes, de vegades no són problemes, de vegades són problemes perquè no reconeixen que ho són, i, per tant, el seu punt de vista serà, estic segur, un gran enriquiment per tots els que esteu aquí. Alguns no sereu juristes i l'hem convidat perquè té una capacitat d'explicar coses complexes d'una forma fàcil d'entendre. El Fernand de Varennes és franco-canadenc, ha estudiat dret, s'ha especialitzat durant anys en temes de drets de les minories i dels drets lingüístics i ha treballat a diferents parts del món. Actualment és professor en una universitat a Austràlia i va i ve en totes les direccions, i ho dic literalment, se'n torna cap allà demà al matí, però dilluns ha de ser a Bilbao. És a dir, és una persona per qui la globalització és exactament això, literalment, i per tant, jo no sé què fas, el jet lag terrible, no? Va resistint, ha après a resistir el jet lag i això és un gran avantatge per tots els que tenen contacte amb ell. Voldria destacar que ha escrit llibres sobre aquesta temàtica, em sembla que us n'adonareu de seguida, que entén molt en com explicar la temàtica i ha estat assessor per diferents organitzacions de caire internacional amb aquesta temàtica dels drets de les minories. I, per tant, per tot això és un gran honor presentar-lo. El fet que puguem presentar-lo és per la seva relació amb Linguapax, que sabeu que és una organització que forma part del Centre UNESCO de Catalunya, UNESCO-CAT, i que li va atorgar un premi l'any 2004 i que em consta que ell fa valdre aquest premi en les diferents activitats que fa. I justament aquests dies, ja feia mesos que sabíem que vindria a Barcelona i amb l'equip de Linguapax estem molt contents d'haver pogut arribar en aquest acord perquè ens pogués parlar avui. Doncs sense més preàmbuls, que Déu-n'hi-do, però vaja, podia estendre'm molt més, dono la paraula al professor de Varennes. Bonsoir. Good evening.
Gracias, Miquel. Chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, señores y señores. I'm honored. I am truly honored to be invited by Linguamón. I'm the chair in multilingualism here at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. And to be here to speak to you tonight. So, muchas gracias per l'honor. Before I begin, I'd like to share a story with you. There's a story about a man walking along a beach after a big storm. And as he's walking on the beach, he sees another person, another man, doing something. He approaches this person and sees that the other person is actually picking up starfish. Comment on dit en catalan?
Estrella de mar.
Estrella de mar. Because after the storm, there are hundreds and hundreds of starfish on the beach. And this man is picking up starfish and throwing them back on the beach. The first person asks him why he is bothering, because there are hundreds of these starfish there, and it seems really hopeless. The person picks another starfish and stops. And he says nothing for a little while. And then he throws this starfish back into the water. And he says, "It matters for this one." And you know, even in the most hopeless situations, even if we make a little bit of difference, that counts. And sometimes when we work in the area of language rights, it may seem like what we're doing is hopeless. Because in many situations of language rights, you are resisting the majority or a government that is very powerful in many countries. So in many cases, it seems like a hopeless case, unless you can help at least one situation. Let me begin my presentation now. But first, I have to make a confession, and Michael did mention it. I am a jurist, which means I have no background in linguistics or social linguistics or even political science. So I hope no one will be tempted to follow the advice of some of Shakespeare's characters of one of his plays, where they were talking about utopia. What would be utopia? And one of the characters said, well, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. I think there is a place, I hope you do not follow that advice, I think there is a place for a legal analysis, approach, and understanding in relation to the language rights and issues related to language rights. So because of my professional background, my presentation will be of a legal nature, so I hope you will forgive me for that. La vie est compliquée. Life is complicated. And this is true also of language rights. Many aspects of what I'll be talking about tonight show that while there is certainly a very positive change of attitudes, and there are a lot of measures, a lot of steps that have been taken, a lot of recognition that has occurred in relation to language issues and linguistic diversity and language rights, unfortunately, the evolution is not so strong or so clear as many of us would like and hope for. I'll talk about despair. Why should we be désespérés? Well, let's look at this. Partially because linguistic diversity is threatened, menacé, endangered. Linguistic diversity is drying out. You had in Barcelona a period where everything was drying, becoming very dry. Well, you know what? The issue of linguistic diversity in the world is suffering something like that also. Languages are dying at an alarming rate. In fact, one language every 2 weeks is disappearing, gone completely. Because, well, just a few people speak most of the world's languages. There's only 4% of the world's people, 4%, very small segment of the world's population, speak 96% of the languages on this planet. And that means that most languages are extremely vulnerable. At the same time, though, there should definitely be hope because of a change of attitude, which has been sweeping the world, and especially here in Europe. There are things that are changing and getting better. And to better understand, buenas tardes, bonjour, bonsoir. Okay, merci. To better understand the situation we are in, and why this presentation is called Hope and Despair, we have to look back at history, our history, to understand the conflicting reactions that exist to language diversity, just as we cannot understand the situation here in relation to Catalan in relation to Basque and other languages in Spain without understanding the legacy of the Franco era. We tend to forget, but there has been a very long time, for a very long time in Europe, a tradition of intolerance and rejection of language diversity, which has a great deal of influence and impact still today in some countries, and maybe even in Spain. And this is linked both to the left and the right ideology. And I want to make it clear that in Europe, historically, both the left and the right have had some problems with diversity. And that may sound strange, but as I'll explain, I think it will become clearer. Diversity of language and culture has sometimes been deemed to be dangerous and a threat to unity because it was thought to discourage assimilation or integration. And in some cases, it was thought that linguistic cultural diversity was backward. And therefore, it was better not to recognize or support minority languages in order not to encourage separation. It's the view that one should only have one language or one people, and even sometimes one religion. At its worst, it is racist and intolerant. It's a kind of ein Reich, ein Volk, eine Sprache. Left and right from the political spectrum. Well, why do I say that? Friedrich Engels and John Stuart Mills, left, right. Both basically said something quite similar. There are differences, but both of them actually agreed that the best thing to do is to get rid of all those nasty, pesky, annoying minorities, to eliminate, in other words, diversity. And it's not so long ago, or they have had a great deal of influence. And the thing that we perhaps forget is that their influence, the influence of Engels in Marxism, of course, and John Stuart Mills in liberal Western thought, politically and legally, are still there. They haven't disappeared completely from both the left and the right political spectrum. So sometimes, every so often, there's a little bit of their influence that you can find, you can detect in the way governments still today react, left or right. You can find some of their influence. John Stuart Mills, he refers to, for example, to the half-savage relics of past times. I like what he says. And he was talking about the Basque and the Irish, but probably also the Catalans, but maybe not. I'll say no. And he was talking about them and other inferior, even backward portion of the human race. And he was basically saying the world would be a much better place if we didn't have those minorities. He is an extremely influential personality in liberal political thought, liberal economic thought. He is still there. In a way, his influence hasn't disappeared. On the other side, on the left, Friedrich Engels. Well, he says something quite similar, calling minorities, and this would include Catalans, ethnic trash. It is beautiful language, don't you think? Ethnic trash. I'm sorry about that. Left and right. They may both be at completely opposite ideological camps. But really, the similarity between the concepts and views held by Engels and Marx and Mills is striking. It's there, it's true. Nationalities, what they called nationalities at the time, is what we would call minorities today. They considered minorities, nationalities, to be doomed to be absorbed. No, in fact, no, that's not right. They needed to be absorbed. They needed to be eliminated, including their languages and culture, of course. Ethnic and cultural diversity. At least if we look at what is written here, for the liberals and the Marxists have for a long time, traditionally, this is simplification, but traditionally for a long time, and a little bit still today in some countries, minorities, ethnic, cultural diversity has been seen as obstacle to progress and development. And you still hear that sometimes. The Chinese, by the way, sometimes we hear about the Chinese government. And the Chinese government in relation to Tibet will always say, yes, but we have brought development to Tibet. the Tibetans were very backwards, weren't they? You know, think about it. They're actually repeating what Engels was saying. The influence of Engels, the influence of Mills, John Stuart Mill, still exists. It's disguised, it's hidden, it's more polite perhaps, but don't believe it's gone completely from the world. For both Marxists and liberals alike, it was the great nations, the great societies, which were the carriers of historical development. Smaller nationalities, their languages and identities were considered to be backward and stagnant. They were expected to abandon, minorities were expected to abandon their identity and assimilate into the majority nation, point final. And that was according to the air du temps, the zeitgeist of the 19th century especially. It was probably like that. Progress and civilization demanded the assimilation of minorities and really the eventual disappearance of much cultural diversity. And in that sense, chers amis, there is a great deal of hope, however, because that has changed. That's no longer true today, generally. We have moved away, maybe not completely, but we have moved away from such views. Not completely. There are exceptions I could talk about. Maybe I will. Perhaps because of today's realization by the international community. I think that there are many parts of the international community who now see, and many governments in the world, who accept that languages are important and who accept that languages should be protected. There really has been, in recent years, let's say 10 years, a great deal of movement to acknowledge and I would say embrace, accept diversity. For example, and I could give you hundreds of examples, but here's a few. Since the year 2000, the 21st of February has been celebrated as International Mother Language Day to promote linguistic and cultural diversity and multilingualism. Good. We're moving away from Engels and Mill. In Europe, that was 2000, the international community. In 2001, well, Europeans did even more. In 2001, you came up with the European Year of Languages. And you have your own European Day, by the way. There's the International Day of Mother Language, the 21st of February. And in Europe, you have the 26th of September also, which is European Day of Languages. No one knows about it, but you still have it, so that's good. So, in a sense, here in Europe, you've actually done very well. You've acknowledged languages, or you acknowledge languages twice a year. You know, the international one on the 21st of February and the European one on the 26th of September. Pretty impressive, kind of. This year, 2008, as you may know, is also acknowledged as the International Year of Languages, as well as the European Year of Intercultural Dialogue. These are mainly symbolic, but they're important because they actually say we don't think minorities or languages are dangerous. We actually think languages and the diversity of languages is wonderful. Let's celebrate, and that's important. It is a move away from an exclusive monolingual approach that believes that you need to have only one language and that's it. You have much more, of course. The European Union last year appointed its first European Commissioner for Multilingualism, Monsieur Leonard Orban, who is responsible for language policy of the European Union, including promoting multilingualism for its citizens and the institutions also of the EU. UNESCO has also appointed Monsieur Jan de Groot as the chargé de mission on the right to education, and he is very much involved in relation to multilingualism in education. And it goes on and on and on. The UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the UN Declaration on the Rights of National or Ethnic, Religious, or Linguistic Minorities, 2005 Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and on and on and on and on. And most of these are, in fact, quite recent. Even well, we could even mention the motto of the European Union, which is in a sense, confirms the richness that is our human and linguistic diversity. My Latin is very bad, so I'm not even going to try to say that, but you can see united in diversity. It actually says diversity is not dangerous. Shouldn't be worried about that. That looks good, doesn't it? It sounds good. All of that makes me feel good. I don't know about you, but yeah, I feel pretty good about all of that. But there are a number of problems, and here is where I have to be on the other side. All of that was hope, but we need to despair a bit now. Most of the documents that are mentioned here, in fact, all of them, except for one, they have no legal value. And here is my background in law that comes out. They're not part of international law. They're not legal documents. You can't force a government to follow what is in here. This is what governments should do, but it is not what governments must do from a legal point of view. And even there are some treaties. There is the 2005 Convention, and that's a treaty. That is a legal document. But when you look at what does it actually say in relation to language and diversity, and what does it mean from a legal point of view, the answer is almost nothing. In reality, many of these, as I said, they sound good, they make people feel good, but beyond that, there's nothing really very demanding from all of these, and especially from a legal point of view. Now, the situation here in Europe is a little bit different. And it is a bit different because you have a number of treaties, legal documents that create legal obligations. And that shows that there are, I would say, glimmers of hope, bits of hope that we can have, because within the Council of Europe, you actually have treaties that have gone further than what exists in international law in relation to language rights and language diversity. There are also other developments in other areas of hope, which I want to mention. And one of them actually is that in recent years, there has been a number of decisions, judgments coming from international tribunals or courts that have showed to us that in fact it is possible to protect language and to have language rights in ways that are perhaps unexpected. One of these is where you have a situation, for example, of autonomy. And there's a great deal of discussion right now in international law that certain groups of people, of communities, should have a right to autonomy. And one of the most effective ways to ensure language rights has, I think, been shown to be a situation of autonomy in many parts of the world. Because autonomy means that you have a population which actually controls its destiny. It controls its institutions, and it controls the language used in these institutions. And that is why in many parts of the world where you have even violent conflicts involving minorities, where they obtain autonomy, usually what it means is that these minority groups can also control the language of power and opportunities within these institutions. And indirectly, they have, in fact, a great deal, or they possibly can have a great deal of protection of their language through autonomy. And this is being realized a lot more now. There are some international lawyers that are saying, in international law, maybe we should recognize our right to autonomy for minorities and indigenous people because of the impact that has on aspects of language and culture. This is a new area. This is something that is developing. Sometimes we will call this a right to autonomy. Sometimes we call this a right to internal self-determination. The words are a bit different, but the concepts are useful. There is a great deal of interest and support for this direction, and it is a direction of hope, of something a little bit unexpected, but which is beginning to appear. I want to repeat something I just said a few moments ago. Language is power. Where a minority language is a language of opportunity and power, not always prestige, but if it is a language, seen as a language of opportunity and power, its status appears to contribute greatly to its stability and even improves on the longer-term use and prospects and survival of that language. Now, that may not sound logical, it may not sound very clear, but let me give you an example. The Swedish language in Finland is interesting because really when we talk about the Swedish language in Finland, it is a situation of despair but also of hope. Look at these numbers. That is pretty desperate in a way. The Swedish language in Finland went from the beginning of the 20th century. It was a dominant language in Finland. For those of you who know the history, the Swedish language had quite a strong position in Finland at the beginning of the 20th century. But look at the numbers, especially the percentage of the population of the Swedish minority in that country. Today, from the beginning of the 20th century, where it was very powerful, it was a language of the elite in Finland. Today, Swedish is threatened. Swedish may eventually evaporate. When you reach 5.6% of the population, and it always goes down, there's no doubt about that, it's continuing to go down, your future is very uncertain. Now, there are laws in Finland. There are laws that says that Swedish is also an official language. But you know, lawyers are clever people. Believe me, they are. And official does not mean necessarily that it is the same or as used as often as the other official language, which is Finnish. In reality, in Finland today, almost everything happens in the Finnish language, and less is done in the Swedish language. The laws that deal with the official status of Swedish, they're not very strong. If you go to a public hospital in Helsinki, if you're lucky, you might find someone who speaks Swedish, but you're more likely than not to be able to find someone who speaks Swedish, the Swedish language. So what happens? Is it a violation of the law? Yes. So you can go to court to have your right to use the official language Swedish protected. No, not really. See, the law says, yes, it's official, but it does not really provide you with a way to go to court to protect your rights. It's a weakness, but that's the way the government wants it. So for this and many other reasons, Swedish is, in fact, in a quite desperate position today, and its position is becoming weaker. But that's only part of the story. Most Swedes or Swedish-speaking citizens of Finland live on the mainland of Finland. But there's a group of islands, the Åland Islands. It's part of Finland. In the Åland Islands, you have about 25,000 people. Almost all of them speak Swedish. And Åland has a special status of autonomy. In fact, really, what we should say is Åland is almost independent. It's semi-independent. It has its own stamps. It controls everything except the Navy, the Army. The Army is not allowed to actually be on Åland Islands. It even controls people who want to live on the island. You cannot simply go there. It's difficult. Now, the situation here is that on the Åland Islands, it is the Swedish language in that part of Finland which is the language of government on the islands. That's it. The language in there, the language of power, the language of opportunity in that part of Finland is Swedish. The public schools only teach in Swedish. They don't even teach through the medium of the main official language of the country, Finnish. In 100 years, remember these, see how the percentage of the population has dropped, of the Swedish-speaking population in Finland? It has dropped on mainland Finland, but in the Åland Islands, there's no drop. the tiny Swedish-speaking minority in the Öland Islands is safe. Its language is not threatened. The Swedish language in the mainland, with 260,000 Swedish speakers, is in fact threatened. You have here an example of, well, I say a glimmer of hope, because there are other countries, other parts of the world, that have seen that you can actually have very strong language rights through some degree of autonomy, an extremely high degree of autonomy for many minorities in the proper context means that their languages, even in an extreme minority situation, can be protected very strongly. Now, one thing I have to say, one argument that you sometimes hear from governments is that that kind of situation means that, well, it's an island, it's easy to create little islands here and there, but these people are a bit backward. They're isolated from the rest of the world. And I want to say that that's not true. Well, they are islands, so in a way they're isolated. But the Swedish-speaking Öland people are not closed to the outside world. They can learn Finnish in school, they can learn English and German, and in fact, they are in some ways more international than perhaps many people on the mainland. Having a high degree of autonomy, being a little bit isolated where it seems geographically, and being taught in a minority language does not mean that you're closed out to the rest of the world. In fact, the reality, I think, of most minorities throughout the world is that they tend to know at least two languages, the minority language very often, and the majority language, and sometimes another international language. So usually it's not the minority that has a problem with language, it's the majority, because they don't try to learn too many languages. The islanders here are not closed to the world. This is false, but it is something you will hear sometimes. I could give other examples about autonomy, but that's not really my topic today. I think you understand that there's a potential, so there's hope using autonomy as a way of protecting language rights. And as I was explaining to Miquel, I'm actually going to Bilbao next week. I have to go back to Australia tomorrow, but then I'm coming back and going to Bilbao next week, where I'll be talking about autonomy and the protection of minorities. So if anyone is interested, come see me in Bilbao next week. Language rights. I'll start with something very basic, very simple. Une langue qu'on n'enseigne pas est une langue qu'on tue. You kill a language, of course, if you don't teach it. So if we have any language rights in international law, surely we have a right to be taught in our own language. Right? No. No, you don't. Not really. It's a bit surprising. Despite everything that the United Nations says, and UNESCO, and the European Union, and the Council of Europe, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, despite all of the nice announcements, declarations, slogans, if you look at international law, does international law guarantee your right to be educated in your own language? No, it doesn't. There is really no legal document in international law. There is no treaty. Remember, I am a jurist. There is no treaty that says everyone has the right to be educated in your own language. Absolutely not. So the most basic aspect of what you would think is your language right is not recognized in the international law, not from a legal point of view. There are other documents that say that's a good idea, but they're not the law. They're not legally binding at the international level. I want to make that clear. Now, Europe is a little bit different, and here is an area of hope. In Europe, you do have the Council of Europe, two Council of Europe treaties that talk about language rights a bit. The Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities and the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. They create hope, but I think it has to be tinged, it has to be affected a little bit with despair. Because on the one hand, they look like they have a great deal of promise, but on the other hand, they don't deliver. What they seem to say isn't quite exactly what it sounds. The Framework Convention and the European Charter are legal documents, they are treaties, But one of the things you have to know from a legal point of view is that none of those treaties are directly enforceable. You cannot go to court, and here in Spain or in Germany or anywhere else in the world or in Europe, you cannot go to court and say, my right under the Framework Convention to education in my language and under certain conditions is violated. Why? Because neither of those treaties, as I said, are not considered by the Council of Europe to be directly applicable. The first one, the Framework Convention. The word framework here is the key. A framework convention means this treaty cannot be applied directly. It's a framework only. It's for the government of a country to decide if they want to adopt a law to apply any of this. Aha! The European Charter. Now, many people believe that the European Charter was a wonderful treaty, and it is for a number of reasons. But the European Charter very clearly says this document does not create any right for any individual or group. This creates obligations on the government. But you as an individual or any group have no rights. In fact, the document, the European Charter, says nowhere says language rights. That's taboo. Forget it. Yet, both documents do create legal obligations on governments, and that's the hope. It says that there are certain rights or obligations in relation to language. There is the Framework Convention, for example, refers to a right to be educated in your own language, but where there is a large enough number of people over a territory, there are all kinds of conditions. And what about the obligations of the government under the European Charter? It says something similar. The measures that are supposed to be chosen by government, it's a complicated treaty, but simply, the measures in relation to education in a minority language should be measures that are appropriate to the language. In other words, if you have a language that is spoken by 10 million people in one country, the use of that language in education should be much higher, even university-level education, as medium of education. But if you have a language which is only spoken by 10,000 people in a country, well, you have to have the appropriate measure in relation to education that corresponds to the situation of that language. So it's not, none of these two treaties, first of all, none of those two treaties can be applied directly in court. Secondly, none of those two treaties says everyone has the right to education in their own language. There's all kinds of conditions. But it does say that in an appropriate situation, individuals or minority languages can be used for education, public education, and other areas of administration by the government. So it is progress. It actually is a huge advancement. These are the strongest legal documents in international law. There is no stronger. But as I said, hope, yes. Evolution, progress, absolutely. But they're not as strong as is the European Convention on Human Rights. Because with the European Convention on Human Rights, you can go to, well, in most countries, you can go to your domestic courts, your courts in your own country, and if it doesn't work out, you can go to the European Court of Human Rights. Unfortunately, here, when we talk about language rights or language obligations, you do not have that option. Well, it's not all bad, but it's not all good, and that's life. C'est compliqué. We have to accept the good with the bad. But there is hope still. So while you have developed many aspects of language rights in Europe with these two legal documents, and I have to say, these two documents, the European Charter and the Framework Convention, are really intended to have a growing influence. The intention really of the Council of Europe is to bring governments to help them in the right direction. That really is the intent of those two legal documents. So it's a long process. It's not something that will have an immediate impact tomorrow. But it is something that actually suggests that there's hope, that we can do something. So, and the other thing it does, which actually is hopeful, is that they provide standards. One thing they do, and they are they both agree, the two documents, is that there are certain things that governments can do and certain things that government cannot do in relation to language. And that is important because until recently, many governments in the world, and still today, believe that they can do anything if it connects to the official language. The Turkish government, for example, banned the Kurdish language until recently. Even playing Kurdish music was a crime. Why? Turkish was the only official language of the country. Of course, you can do that. These documents now, even though legally speaking they're weak, they do say these are the types of policies, of laws that you must do in relation to language. You cannot simply say it's a crime to speak French in Barcelona. And that might sound like a crazy example, but you know, in the 1980s, in Bulgaria, it was an offense to speak Turkish in the streets. In fact, there was a joke. The joke was the most expensive language in Europe is Turkish because there was a fine. You had to pay 200 lei every time you spoke Turkish. It's amazing what governments can do sometimes in relation to language. These documents actually say very clearly, you can't do that. These are the things you cannot do in terms of the standards. So there is hope, and there is despair, but there is more that can bring a bit more hope, I would say, to many parts of the world. And it's here that I would like to highlight the importance of the interaction of language rights and international human rights. I mean, these documents are specialized documents. But there's also a connection between what we call human rights and international law and language. One thing that is clear is that the choice of an official language, there are many cases that say that the choice of an official language is not affected by international human rights law. It's a little bit like having an official religion. What is clear in international law is that a government can choose whatever religion it wants as official. You cannot discriminate, but you can choose something that's official. It's the same in relation to language. If Canada wanted to have Inuktitut or Swahili is the official language of Canada tomorrow, does that violate any international human rights law? Well, no, as long as you respect human rights. So saying Swahili is an official language is not a problem. It's what you do afterwards that is the problem. By the way, can I say a joke? My jokes are very bad, by the way. My students tell me all the time that I should never tell jokes. There's an old Woody Allen movie called Bananas. And in 1974, well, it's not too old, I think. And in that movie, Woody Allen, the character of Woody Allen, is in the middle of a revolution in Central America. And the revolution succeeds, and the leader of the rebels becomes El Presidente. El Presidente becomes crazy with power. Many people do. And one of the things after he becomes president is he goes to the piazza, that's the Italian, I think, plaza, and tells people, announces that the official language of the Republic is going to be Swahili. Actually, it wasn't my idea. It actually is in the movie. El Presidente is assassinated, of course. Why? Well, this is Central America. No one speaks Swahili in Central America. But there's a serious side. What happens if you choose as an official language that means that most of the population of that country do not speak the language? They're excluded. They're disadvantaged. They cannot work in the government if they don't speak the official language. They become outside. They have no opportunity, no power. And that is actually what happens in many countries in the world with an official language. And it is here, and that's a bit much, I'll explain as we go along. Lawyers tend to, we're paid, the more we write, the more we talk, the better we're paid. What has happened in the last 20 years, less than that actually, 15 years or so, is a series of decisions in international human rights that have said that even if you have an official language, you cannot violate human rights, and this is what it means. The first case I mentioned is Ballantyne versus Canada. And I think many of you may know this case. At one point in Quebec, the government of Quebec had adopted a law which made French the only language for commercial signs. Everything had to be in French only in Quebec, even private signs. That's the official language of Quebec. So if you believe some traditional views, official language means you can do anything in relation to language. The United Nations Human Rights Committee said, no, that's not true. To limit the private use of a language is a violation of freedom of expression, because language is part of expression. Now, one thing I have to add, and by the way, that was the first time, that's 1993, it's not very long ago, the first time in international law that we clearly said there are human rights that can restrict your official language policies. Before that, we did not know in international human rights that a human right can affect language. 1993, it's actually not long ago at all. One thing the committee did add, which is interesting and important, it said it is legitimate to protect the French language in Quebec. It is allowed. You should do it, in fact. The committee seemed to say, we accept that it is appropriate to protect the French language. But you cannot do it to the extent that you violate basic human rights. And the committee said, or hinted, that, in Quebec, what you could do is you could require the use of French and allow them to use whatever language they want in private activities. That's what they did. 2008 years ago, another case, and this one is a problem. This one actually is anyone here who's a lawyer? Legal background? I feel like a minority here. Okay. In 2000, a case of Diergaard versus Namibia. The United Nations Human Rights Committee said it involved the Afrikaans language in Namibia. English is the only official language in that country. In fact, the Constitution says English is the official language, no other ones. The committee said, well, wait. If you only use English, you have these people, in that case, there were people who were disadvantaged because they were not fluent in English. And the committee said, well, even if it's your official language, do you have a reason why you're not using Afrikaans and only using English? And the government of Namibia gave no answer. So the committee said, well, excuse us, but if you have, even if it is the official language, if you have a language preference that creates a disadvantage or excludes people, you have to prove that it's reasonable and justified. If you cannot, it is discrimination, and you must stop the discrimination. In the context of Namibia, it meant that the Afrikaans language had to be used at least for these people, a little bit. That means, all of a sudden, in addition to the only official language of the country, the committee said there are situations where, unless it's justified and reasonable to only use the official language, if it's not reasonable and justified, then you have to use other languages in addition to the official language. It does not mean that the Afrikaans language must be official. That's not what it means. It simply says that there are situations where you must use it because it's justified and reasonable in the circumstances. That is only in 2000, but that is almost a revolution. From a legal point of view, this is extremely difficult to accept for many lawyers and judges. Because until then, I, as a law student in Canada, was taught that you have no language rights outside of a language legislation. And here, what the UN Human Rights Committee says, in some situations, it could be discrimination not to use other languages. But this is only 2000. It's only 8 years ago. It is a decision which is not well known. It is a decision which is even not taught yet in most law schools in Spain. I'm sure of that. In most parts of the world, law students are not taught about this. Lawyers are very conservative. We're a bit slow sometimes. it will take time for this to trickle down, to be understood. But it will happen. And that's why I say there's hope. Coming from sources which, from a legal point of view, we would not have thought may be possible, even a few years ago. Even a more recent case, Cyprus versus Turkey, the European Court of Human Rights. This is a very complicated decision. But basically, the European Court said that in Cyprus, because the government of northern Cyprus had started to teach in the Greek language, the government had to continue to teach in the Greek language in high school, the secondary level. I say it's complicated because until then, even today, if you go to pick up a law book, any legal book that talks about language and the right to education in international law, especially in Europe, I can guarantee you, almost all of them would say you have no right to education under the European Convention on Human Rights, no right to education in your own language. And yet here the court seems to say something like that. Not quite. No, it's a very difficult decision to accept in a way. But what it does is opens the door. It actually says there are situations where you have to use a minority language or a non-official language in education. And that is another revolution. This is difficult to accept, but it's there. And so there's unexpected hope in areas that do exist. But it will take time for lawyers and judges and law professors. Law professors are among the worst in the world, I think, to actually absorb this and present it afterwards. By the way, this case of Cyprus versus Turkey is a bit strange also because the government of northern Cyprus actually had offered to those students not only either for the high school, to the secondary school, you can go to a secondary school in Turkish. And if you know the problem between the Greek and the Turks, you know that's not really an option, or in English. And the parents actually said, no, we don't want education in English. It's very strange, because in most parts of the world they want that for whatever reason. This is an area of hope which does exist, and it will take time. It will take 10, 20 years before we have more clarity on this. But what I think is important is that this is a part of a continuing evolution that will take many more years to coalesce and to be clarified, but at least they offer an increasing degree of hope for the future, especially if you look also at if there is some form of a right to autonomy that appears, that takes shape. Now, having said that, are we anywhere any closer in having ways to stop the flood of languages which are likely to disappear in the next 100 years? No, we're not. No, we have to be honest about that. Not if we look at what is happening from a legal point of view at the international or European levels. But at the same time, we do live in a period where the prevailing zeitgeist, environment feeling, is at least sympathetic to the whole notion that we do not have to be, nor should we all be, identical ethnically or linguistically. And the way the concept of non-discrimination is increasingly understood, the increased willingness of the international community to consider some right or some form of autonomy for minorities and indigenous peoples, I think, suggests that there may be additional means for perhaps, at least in some cases, in a number of cases, to protect and ensure the survival and even the prosperity of part of our common human heritage. So, as a realistic optimist, or an optimistic realist, I always have problems with that, I still do not believe that the world will end up being one big McDonald's restaurant. There are many push and pull factors that are involved, and there are tools at the legal and political levels that may, in the end, I think, allow many languages and cultures to coexist and flourish, even though many of them will disappear. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That was going to happen. So my view of the future of language rights in Europe is one of cautious optimism. You have made, I think, really in Europe, you have to acknowledge this, you have made some amazing progress with the Council of Europe. If you think of the past and our history, we have done a great deal. And with the Council of Europe and the European Union, And it seems, I think, that there has been some dramatic changes in terms of the legal treatment as well as the political and perhaps even public perception of the importance and place of languages in society. So I think we can say that language diversity is not seen as a threat or something backward anymore. That's finished. Language diversity today, I think, is seen as an asset, something that's a richness and that needs to be protected, promoted, and embraced. But at the same time, as I said, not everything is what it seems, and maybe the measures that are approved in Europe are not necessarily as dramatic in their influence and impact as they initially seem. In other words, especially from a legal point of view, the protection of languages and language rights is not as strong in Europe as sometimes it's presented or argued to be. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think here in Catalonia especially, you realize that in relation to your experience with the European Union. So, let me try to make some kind of general conclusions. And then we have time for questions. Oh, good. First, fundamental to being a democracy in Europe, I think it is, you have as a basic principle now, it is pretty widely accepted that states have to respect cultural and linguistic diversity. And that means more than just tolerating different languages. It also means, I think, and when you look at many of the documents that I mentioned earlier, that you have to try to use other languages as far as is reasonably possible. And this is, once again, almost a revolution in thinking, if you remember some of the traditional views of the liberals and Marxists, not to mention the legacy of the Jacobin influence in France and other countries. It means pluralism and respect for individuals so that linguistic and cultural preferences must be acknowledged and accommodated rather than ignored or even suppressed. Support, which I think reflects the interest and wishes of the users of these languages, is essential to their preservation and development as far as is reasonably possible. Diversity is good. Diversity needs to be protected, and I think in Europe you have accepted that. So these diversity, respect for pluralism, multilingualism, these principles are accepted as the building blocks of a new Europe, the building blocks of democratic societies, based on tolerance and respect for diversity and the human rights of minorities. I would even say they form like a roadmap to peace, because in many parts of the world where you have violent ethnic conflicts, it is because we actually have not, or governments have not treated language diversity in the way which respects the basic human rights that actually do relate to language, as I described earlier. On the positive side, the side of hope, there has been a monumental shift in thinking, and that battle has been won. The idea that diversity is good is won. I don't think we need to worry about that too much. But there are still many other struggles ahead. The practice. Now, what does it mean? How do we put that into place? Those struggles still need to be done to a large degree, because a lot of what exists are declarations, documents, recommendations, and even the treaties that you have. They're good, but you need to strengthen them. They're not strong enough. They need to be clarified, because of many aspects are still unclear, especially when we talk about human rights and language. But don't forget this. The present that we have today is so much better than the past. And really, it should energize us for the future. Because I think there is one thing that is clear. You cannot be complacent. You have to always be vigilant and willing to explore whatever avenues and options might work best in your context. But you know what? I'm an optimist, really. I believe that the world is changing, and we can only hope for the better. And I think hopefully there will be some changes happening on the other side of the big water in the near future. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say gracias, many thanks for your patience, and especially many thanks for coming here tonight. There's so many other things you could be doing in a beautiful place like Barcelona. Gracias, merci. That's it.
com ha dit, si hi ha preguntes i comentaris a fer, ara obrim el torn, sisplau, amb tota llibertat. Si voleu fer les preguntes en qualsevol de les 4 llengües olímpiques del 92, no hi ha cap problema.
Jo encara que sé anglès, però...
Micròfon, s'il vous plaît.
El micròfon, sí.
Encara que sé anglès, però millor que ho diguis tu, ni tradueixis. No creieu que l'anglès és un obstacle, que es perden moltes llengües perquè molta gent troba molt més fàcil parlar en anglès en aquests llocs en què la llengua és difícil perquè hi ha poca gent o perquè no hi ha protecció, i això ajuda. Però bueno, potser no hi podem fer res.
Yeah. In some countries, English is actually a dangerous language, actually. The Chinese government is very clever. My ex-wife is Chinese, so I can say that. In Tibet, the Chinese government will tell you that Tibetan and Chinese are official languages, and that's true. The Chinese government will tell you that Tibetan is offered in schools, in public schools. You can learn Tibetan. Some primary schools also teach in Tibetan, but their numbers are going down. But the Chinese government will always tell you that parents have a choice. If they want their children to learn Tibetan, this is offered. What the Chinese government does not tell you is that very often the Tibetan language is offered at the same time as English. So think about this. The Tibetan parent has a choice. They have to learn Chinese, so they have no choice. In fact, the main language of education now is Chinese. And if they want their children to have an opening to the world, there is tourism now going to Tibet, the parents will want their children to learn English. But if their children learn English to have more opportunities, that means they have to abandon Tibetan. It's very clever, because when the government of Tibet says, we offer this to the parents and they do not want education in Tibetan, it's true, but only because they're opposing it to English. English has become the international lingua franca. But I think a problem, other than the example I gave you, is that we should not look at English to be the exclusive language of international communication. What is needed is, of course, learn English or Chinese or German. But you do not have to sacrifice your own language to do that. And there are many studies that show that the best way to acquire multilingualism is first to be taught in your own language, your home language, and then to acquire additional languages later. So the problem, the difficulty in a number of countries is that some governments and some parents believe that in order to learn English, they must be educated only in English. I think this is a mistake. And in fact, in South Africa, there are studies that show that students that learn in their home language stay in school longer and succeed better than students from African background that go to English medium schools. Because they go to a school where they don't speak the language. And the statistics show very clearly that they have a high dropout rate. They leave school relatively young because the language is simply not their language. And those that do finish, or do continue with education, actually tend to fail the final years, the high school graduation. There's like half of black students who go to schools in English fail. Whereas if they go to their home language, a school that teaches in their home language, very clearly the success rate is actually higher. So I hope that answers your question.
Em sento obligat, com a persona que té l'anglès com a llengua paterna, a acabar el comentari sobre el Tibet, perquè el somni del govern xinès no és que els nens del Tibet parlin en anglès amb els fills, sinó que parlin en xinès amb els fills. I per tant, en aquest cas, l'anglès és l'instrument que utilitza el govern xinès per promoure el xinès a les escoles, entenc. Si no en defensa de l'anglès, en tot cas posar les coses en perspectiva, això no és una iniciativa del món anglòfon, sinó una utilització per part d'un règim que ha envaït Tibet per promoure el xinès.
There are many more questions.
Sí.
You have based your speech on public sector role and United Nations conventions. So I'd like to ask two things. The first, linguistic limits and political frontiers don't match. So how do we deal with that? Is there any convention focusing the not matching of linguistic and political limits? This is the first. And the second, enterprises and global companies have a lot of power, an increasing power, more than states. So what about if I am working in a company and they are compelling me to speak and to work in another language, not my community language?
On the first point, let me say that in international law, no, there's not really any way to deal with the non-correspondence between political limits and language, for example, language communities. Basically, you have to understand this. In international law is a law created by governments, by countries. So a very basic principle is that the sovereignty of the state is sovereign. So it is exceptional for international law to intervene. So where you have a mismatch between community or linguistic community and the borders of a state, the international law usually stays out, does not get involved, because it is a state that is sovereign. Or, as I showed, I was telling you about, we have human rights. International human rights actually limits the sovereignty of the state. So there's a bit of influence there that you can use to restrict or to change some of the policies of a government, which may not respect the rights of a minority or an indigenous people. But in terms of international law, and I'm talking as a legal person, not a politician, the short answer is no, there is not. So that is unfortunate, but that is the reality, the way the international system works. But I also said that there is a movement towards autonomy, and that in a way connects a little bit with your question, but it's not part of international law yet. I think it will maybe in the future, but when I say future, 20 years' time, you may not be alive. Maybe you will, I don't know. You're young, so you'll be alive. The language of work. There's a lot happening in the United States, actually, where companies say, at work, you can only speak English. So this deals mainly with Hispanic workers very often. What is happening in the United States is that there are laws that says that in the workplace, as an employee, you cannot discriminate. Discrimination against an employee can mean, are you allowing your employee to have private conversations? If you're allowing your employee to have private conversations, you cannot tell your employee not to have one in Portuguese. Why? Because that could be discrimination. If I'm allowed to use French when I work, and I'm talking about private, for my employer to say that you cannot use Portuguese is discrimination. I'm allowed to use my own language, you're not. So in the United States, and there are other countries where it's clear, that if a company forces someone to speak one language, it can be possibly discrimination. It's a basic human right. It's a little bit difficult, but that is the only possibility. So it does exist, and in fact there are many cases in the United States. But the United States is not a good example because some of what they say is it's crazy. But from a legal point of view, that is the possibility. And as you know, in Quebec, there's also an issue about that, about the companies, and to what degree can they impose French? And this is going to be also a debate. But there is, in fact, a human right that can be involved.
Aviam, jo és que... Primer, gràcies per la cita de John Stuart Mill i Engels, perquè m'ha recordat una cita del president Tarradellas que deia que per un català no hi ha res que s'assembli més que un espanyol de dretes un espanyol d'esquerres. Però, en fi, això era una altra qüestió. A mi el que m'interessa saber és el tema de la immigració en el context d'una llengua minoritària que, com la nostra, aquí a Catalunya, al nostre país, doncs, queda molt endarrerida ara el seu ús i la seva presència, i clar, la realitat s'imposa per si sola, molt més enllà del que la jurisprudència i els esforços que es poden anar fent volen marcar en aquest sentit del zeitgeist aquest de voler respectar les llengües minoritàries, però hi ha un fet que és en controvèrsia i a mi és el que més em preocupa, no?
That's a very interesting question. It's a very difficult issue. But there is one example that might help. It's different from Catalonia, of course, but in Quebec, they have some of the same difficulties here. But in Quebec, 10, 20 years ago, there was a special agreement between the government of Quebec and the government of Canada that allowed the government of Quebec to choose most of the immigrants that went there. And I don't have it here, but there are statistics that show that in at least the last 5 or 8 years, the majority of immigrants that go to Quebec speak French, or they actually go with the French minority language side. And that is an important factor because in a country like Canada, a lot of the population growth obviously comes through immigration. So at least because of this special agreement between the government of Quebec and the government of Canada, they have been able to actually have immigration which is more French-oriented, which is, when you think that this is North America, it's an Anglo-Saxon ocean with an island of French. That's pretty good. But there's something else that happens in Quebec, and there's another reason why immigrants actually are moving more towards the French side. French is the language of power and opportunity in Quebec. The English is quite strong, but in Quebec, because of the main language of government is French. The main language now of employment and of opportunities actually now is French. So I think the Quebec government has been successful in this way through a number of measures, including one relating to private businesses. Private companies that are bigger than a certain size must be able to function completely in French. They can also function in English or Chinese or Portuguese, but they must have a bilingual ability, and even though these are private companies. And so, an immigrant that arrives in Quebec sees what? Sees that opportunities, most of the opportunities in Quebec are in French. And what does an immigrant want? Immigrants want success. So by using those two approaches, many experts talk about the immigration agreement with the government of Canada, and that is important. But I think another very important factor is that the Quebec government has it's not perfect, they have serious problems still, but they have been able to make French in the province of Quebec the main language of power and opportunity. And many immigrants, not all of them, but many immigrants actually choose to go in that direction. Because if they do not come from an English Anglo-Saxon environment, if they're Italian or African or Arab, and opportunities are mainly in French, of course, this is what they should do. And this is what they are doing. I've seen the demographic statistics in Quebec. The percentage of those people who identify as French, who identify with the French-speaking community, and those that identify with the English-speaking community have stabilized. They're pretty stable. The French maybe has gone a little bit up. Or rather, the French has been rather stable. The English, those that identify as English-speaking, has gone down a bit, and the immigrant portion has gone up. But as I said, it seems that the immigrant portion, the majority, is now connecting with the French language side. So immigration, very difficult area, of course, especially if you do not control immigration. The Åland Islands that I showed, in that case, they actually control immigration, basically, okay? And they're safe. They're only 25,000. But if you can have some influence on residents or immigration, and especially if your language is clearly a language of power and opportunity, it may be possible. Thank you.
In the background of your presentation, there is a sculpture of two persons in the attitude of talking to each other.
Oh, yes.
In order to talk, they have at least one common language. Two questions. First, where is this sculpture? Who is the author? Second, why did you choose the just backward?
I don't need this. I used it because sometimes when we talk about language rights is about communicating. And I have been accused sometimes of only talking about the minority. And I've been accused of actually supporting linguistic ghettos, division, separation. That's not what I'm doing. I'm actually saying that we can be different. But we can be different, keep our language, and have other languages also at the same time. This is, to me, what it means to have diversity. And language rights is simply a way of showing how we can balance all of that. We can communicate en français, in Deutsch, well, many different languages. We now have translation, very good translation, and we have to thank the translators for the great work. There are ways. Being different should not be seen as an obstacle to communication. We can be different, and we can communicate. There's no problem with that. And I thank you for that question. You're the first one ever who has asked me about that. Thank you.
Seguint en la mateixa línia, no hem de parlar sempre de minories. No hi ha casos en què hauríem de parlar de les majories. Potser les majories són problemes de vegades.
Oui. No, c'est tout à fait vrai. That's absolutely true. Usually, in most countries, it is the minority who has less power and who usually have their language rights not respected. But there are examples in history where it's the majority. In many African countries, in fact, the domination of French or English or Spanish or Portuguese means that the largest language groups actually are discriminated against. In Mozambique, the official language, the language of education, is mainly Portuguese. 70% of the population do not speak Portuguese. And I think that is a problem. The policies in some governments, the elite in some governments in the world, is sometimes detrimental even to very large segments of the population, even sometimes on the majority. In South Africa, you had the white apartheid regime, which imposed mainly Afrikaans as the main language of government. Obviously, not the language of most Africans in South Africa. And there are other examples that do exist similar. It's not always the minority. It is usually a situation where those that do not have power actually are denied their rights in this area, but there are other examples in history that are different. Even, for example, Latvia. In Latvia, almost half the population speak Russian. Not the majority, but not far. But they have less and less language rights. The language, the Russian is no longer used at universities. Russian is being eliminated more and more, in fact, almost completely eliminated from public schools. They're almost the majority. And even now, to become a citizen, when you become a citizen of Latvia, you must have a Latvian-sounding name. The government gives you a Latvian-sounding name. You don't have a choice. So even though almost half the population is Russian, they are no longer allowed to have a Russian name. It has to sound Latvian. So, and even though they're almost majority. The world is full of examples like that, and we don't realize it, but this is an area where, there's so much to do. But at least we have a few tools in law, in politics, that we can now use, and it's a lot better than 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago.
Last one.
Oh.
Si no hi ha més preguntes, faria una última pregunta, que és un problema que s'ha generat amb l'ampliació de la Unió Europea, en què la Unió Europea, a Copenhaguen, en una reunió, va establir uns criteris de tractament de les minories dels estats candidats i van dir no entreu si no compliu amb aquests requisits. I alguns d'aquests països van dir home, ens esteu demanant a nosaltres que complim amb unes condicions que en alguns països actuals doncs, no s'estan complint aquestes condicions. Does that make sense?
It does. Let me answer the first question, which I did not answer properly. I'm reading it now. In many parts of the world, when we talk about language, it's usually presented as a minority problem. Minorities are a problem because they demand language rights. Actually, it's more of a majority problem in many countries. It's the majority that do not accept that you should be entitled to use your language. In the United States, there are some parts, the governments in some parts of the United States do not like Spanish. There is too much Spanish. The problem is not the Spanish minority. The Spanish actually learn, the Hispanics, they learn English. It may take a few years, but they learn it. The problem is the governments. The United States is an English-speaking country. English only. If you don't like English, go home. The problem is the majority, their attitude, which is sometimes intolerant and sometimes racist. We should call it for what it is. I think it is racist. So that's actually the answer of your first question. Sorry. The EU enlargement. Yes, there are criteria which only apply to new countries who want to be admitted to the European Union. They must accept certain standards such as the protection of the human rights and minority rights. But it only applies to new countries and not all members of the European Union. Absolutely. That is, but you know what? This is the problem where you have politics instead of law. Because these are the political criteria for admission to the European Union. So because it's political, you can choose to apply it to these but not apply it to those, instead of having the law apply to everyone. I completely agree. It is, in a way, it's discrimination between countries. It's unfortunate. It is hypocritical, in my view. But that is the political decision that was made. You see why the law is important. You should have lawyers more often here. That's a joke, sorry. Okay.
Una última pregunta, però com a curiositat i personal. Amb aquesta nova tribu que s'ha descobert ara a l'Amazònia, tan minoritària, si vostè fos... Personalment, vostè què faria amb ells? Que respecte amb ells, esclar, vull dir.
I would tell them to hide.
Molt bé, abans de llegir dues línies que espero que el professor comprendrà en veu alta, vull agrair a l'Institut LinguaPax el fet d'haver-nos deixat el professor fins a les 8, han dit a les 8, sisplau, ha de continuar perquè té un altre compromís i per tant volem agrair molt LinguaPax per haver-nos col·laborat en fer possible aquesta conferència. Jo havia escrit aquí la dita popular catalana, advocats i procuradors a l'infern de dos en dos. Però estic segur que estareu amb mi que farem una excepció en aquest cas i donarem moltes gràcies al professor de Varennes, no sense que jo doni les gràcies als intèrprets, a l'equip tècnic, a l'Alexia allà, que sempre fa aquesta feina silenciosa i de gran competència organitzant aquestes activitats. Vull convidar, si hi ha algú que vol que se l'informi per correu electrònic de les pròximes activitats de la càtedra, doncs Alexia, la teniu allà al fons, aixeca't, sisplau, i llavors li podeu deixar l'adreça i suposo que estareu amb mi de donar realment moltes gràcies al professor de Varennes per haver-nos fet entenedor i senzill unes qüestions que en principi semblaven molt i molt complexes i espero que tots acabarem sent realistes però optimistes gràcies a ell. Moltes gràcies.